FSR 3.1 with frame generation is now working on some Steam Deck games. This could be absolutely massive for handhelds like the Steam Deck. I'm going to talk about that as well as some modding news for the Steam Deck, a new Steam controller, kind of. Welcome to the NerdNest. I'm Bill, and this is my channel all about the gaming industry. If it's your first time here and you enjoy the show, consider subscribing. If you're already subscribed, click on that like button because it absolutely helps out a ton. Let's start off with FSR 3.1 and frame generation. A little while ago, I made a video about frame generation and upscaling technologies, and I said that these types of tech are the next big battleground for how we're going to see improvements in video games. AMD's FSR 3.1 with frame generation is pretty crazy. Nexus, which is the company behind some very popular PC ports of some PlayStation published games, specifically Ghost of Tsushima, Horizon Forbidden West, Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, and the Spider-Man games, they've all recently made updates to those games to take advantage of frame generation with FSR 3.1. I'll explain what frame generation is for those of you that don't know, and for those of you that do know, don't skip ahead. Make sure that I get it right, and if there's something that I got wrong or I screwed up, let me know in the comments down below that like button. My understanding of what frame generation is where the system inserts an interpolated frame for smoother looking gameplay, and it's designed to work in cases where you're limited by the CPU or the GPU, which is perfect for handheld PC systems as they are pretty severely constrained by the limited power that they can draw from the battery. Basically, it works like this. If this is frame 1 and this is frame 2, then we can guess that this is what the frame between those two frames would look like. And then the game can insert that frame in order to make gameplay look smoother. It also uses resolution upscaling to allow you to run a game at lower resolutions, which will help your frame rate, and then upscale it to make it look nice. It has latency reduction, and it doesn't require specific hardware, unlike NVIDIA's solution. Now, it is very important to point out that if you are running a game at sub 60 frames per second or 30 frames per second, you're going to get some visual artifacting during gameplay because the game doesn't have enough information to accurately interpolate a new frame. AMD specifically recommends that you do this with games that are running at 60 frames per second or higher. But this is the worst that this technology is ever going to be. And going forward, as we get more and more advances in this kind of tech, we're going to see the power floor required for gaming systems get lower and lower, or at least the power floor will stay the same and the games will look better and better. ETA Prime recently released a video where he tested AMD FSR 3.1 with frame generation on a bunch of Nexus games, including Spider-Man, Ratchet & Clank, Horizon, and the results were really promising. But it only works on those specific games right now. Right now, AMD frame generation has to be enabled on a game-by-game basis by the developers. However, AMD's FSR 2 is built into the Steam Deck already. Of course, that doesn't have any of the cool frame generation stuff in it, but as this tech matures, it's going to make it easier and easier to play modern games on lower power systems like the Steam Deck and other PC handhelds or laptops. Basically, as games get support for FSR 3.1, everyone is going to have a better experience no matter what hardware you're running on. Whether or not this can be implemented, directly into the Steam Deck like FSR currently is, that remains to be seen. Having it run outside the game means that it's not going to be as accurate, so I don't know if FSR 3.1 with frame generation can come to the Steam Deck as a whole, or if it will always require to be made on a game-by-game basis. But as we move forward, I think the presence of these technologies like FSR or XeSS from Intel or NVIDIA's solution or any of the other solutions that are out there, I think that more and more modern games are going to have these frame generation and upscaling stuff built into the games, and it's going to make it easier for us to play these games on lower powered hardware. which is awesome. Modding on the Steam Deck just got a lot easier, or it's about to get a lot easier. It's still in its early stages, but Nexus Mods has a new app which will make running modded games on your Steam Deck just as easy as it is on Windows. My favorite genre of game is the massively multiplayer online role-playing game, and when World of Warcraft was released, it was pretty much the only game that I played for years and years. One of the reasons was because of the moddability of the game. Blizzard allowed end users to use Lua scripting to make their own UI for the game. And if I'm fully honest, I probably spent more time tweaking and changing my UI than I did actually playing the game. But I had fun, so who cares? Nexus Mods was one of the places that people would go to when modding World of Warcraft and other MMOs like Elder Scrolls Online, for example. I have to admit, I haven't used their site in years, as I haven't played those games in a really long time, but I know that there are tons of people that modding is very, very important to their gameplay experience. So they're going to love the fact that Nexus Mods is now supporting Linux. It's currently in alpha and it only supports Stardew Valley at this point, but the other games will come eventually. Essentially, they're taking their time and building the mod management app slowly in order to avoid conflicts that would break someone's games, because that would be a terrible experience. But this is going to go a long way towards making that experience better. Nexus Mods says that after Stardew Valley, it looks like they're going to work on support for Cyberpunk 2077, and then they're going to follow up with Baldur's Gate 3 and then Bethesda game support. Of course, some games use the built-in Steam Workshop for modding, which is great, although I personally have very little experience outside of Tabletop Simulator for D&D assets when playing, games like that with my friends. But overall, I think that it's exciting to see, companies like Nexus Mods pay attention to Linux, which is never something I would have ever expected to happen before the Steam Deck arrived. Moving on to Steam Input, Valve recently had an update about Steam controllers, and we have some new Steam controllers, kind of, sort of, maybe, depending on where you live. We'll get to that in a second. If you were around during the original Steam machines and Steam controller announcements, most PC games, they weren't really optimized or made with controllers in mind, and gamepad support for those games was really weak. That was reflected in the stats, which Valve recently talked about. They said back in 2018, about 5% of gaming sessions on Steam were using a controller. That number, which you should remember because we'll come back to it in a little bit, is not a huge surprise. Traditionally, games on PC are built with a mouse and keyboard in mind, but as we started seeing more and more games that were either ported from console or simultaneously released on console and PC, we started seeing more controller support. But Valve didn't want to wait for devs to build in controller support, which is why they made the Steam controller. The Steam controller gave end users the ability to play almost any game on a controller, even if that game was made specifically with mouse and keyboard in mind. Unfortunately for Valve, many people didn't really give the controller a fair shake. You take that and you add it to the Steam machines that it was supposed to go with, kind of fell on their face, as devs didn't want to support, they didn't want to port their games to Linux. And the paddles on the back of the controller ended up leading to a lawsuit, which eventually led to Valve selling off the remaining stock in a fire sale for like $5 a piece, and started focusing on Proton and the Steam Deck instead. So I guess on one hand, I'm glad that the OG Steam controller, failed, but man, I love that thing. In fact, I have an entire video about what I love about the Steam controller and what I would like to see from a Steam controller 2. I will link to that at the end of this one, so hopefully you can stick around until the end to watch that. Let's rewind. That number that I told you to remember, do you remember it? 5%. That's the percent of sessions that were controller-based on Steam in 2018, just 6 years ago. In those 6 years, that number has tripled, which means the controller use on Steam, according to Valve, has increased by 200%. But what controllers are these people using? Well, 59% of them are using Xbox controllers, although that's a little misleading, and I'll get to that in a moment. 26% are using PlayStation controllers, and 10% are on Steam Decks. Now, I suppose you could possibly figure out how prevalent the Steam Deck is based on these numbers and how many Steam sessions There have been in the last year, but that's math I don't feel like doing. So if you feel like doing that math and you figure out the number, post it in the comments down below so that we can all figure, look at your math with you and see if you got it right. So how is the number of Xbox controllers misleading? Well, lots and lots of third-party controllers are recognized as an Xbox controller. It's kind of the default. So while this breakout looks really dominated by Xbox controllers, I'm betting a majority of those are actually third-party stuff, or if it's not a majority, it's at least a significant portion of them. But that's still not the most interesting thing that Valve said in this post. The most interesting thing that Valve said in this post is that they support over 300 controllers in Steam input, and they recently added support for this, the HORIPAD for Steam. I've got some good news and I've got some bad news for this controller. Let's start with the good news. The HORIPAD for Steam looks great. It has a giant ass Steam button sitting in the middle. It also has the quick access menu button. It has gyro, back paddles, some extra buttons on the front, and most importantly, it has capacitive thumbsticks so you can activate gyro when you're touching the sticks or deactivate when you let go. This means that if you're playing with your Steam Deck docked, you essentially have all the same stuff that you have on the Steam Deck with the exception of the trackpads. The lack of trackpads on this is part of the bad news. The trackpads are incredibly powerful on the Steam Deck because they allow you to do so much more than just control via a mouse. You can do some crazy shit with the trackpads, and you can accomplish almost all of it with a thumbstick and an extra button, but the trackpads are definitely a more elegant solution, and they're better for control than a joystick is. The other bad news is that this is limited currently to Japan only, but since Hori is partnering with Valve on this, I don't see why we can't have other companies do the same thing. But the real bad news here is, does this mean that Valve doesn't want to make their own controller anymore? I really hope that that isn't the case. If I've said it once, I've said it a million times. Valve, ship a Steam controller that is a Steam Deck without the screen. You will sell tons of them. With Valve partnering with third parties to make hardware, it makes me think that Valve is maybe taking the same approach with controllers as Microsoft is with handhelds. Let somebody else do it, we'll benefit anyway, which might be true, but still, I want a Steam controller from Valve. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, then you're probably going to enjoy this one right here. From the NerdNest, I'm Bill, and I hope you stay rad.